Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0. And it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributed to a championship. I know including all-star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. The 6th episode in the series compares 2 New York City playground legends who both won MVPs in the ABA, put up similar numbers and had short careers due to injuries and are thus forgotten by a lot of modern NBA fans. Connie Hawkins was a pioneering athletic specimen most compared to the next Elgin Baylor, but was blackballed from the NBA during his prime for being related to a scandal, even though there's no evidence of it. Eventually, Hawkins filed a lawsuit that allowed him to finally play in the NBA, but his injuries had piled up by then and he had a fairly short NBA career. Billy Cunningham started off his career as one of the best 6 men in NBA history before becoming a superstar, much like his contemporary John Havlicek did, but also had a career cut short due to injury. Despite their short careers, I'll also look at their ABA achievements and find out who had the best overall career between these 2 underrated legends. So let's find out. Both Hawkins and Cunningham were very good scorers in their prime, which is evidenced by the fact that both had very big differences in their stats between their peaks and their career averages. Although Hawkins averaged only 18.7 points per game in his career, he peaked at a monstrous 30.2 points per game in 1969 in the ABA, and in the playoffs averaged a stellar 25 points per game with a peak of 29.9 points per game in 1968. He also had a scoring title in the ABA, although he was at a time when the ABA was just starting out and didn't have a lot of talent. Billy had a career points per game of 21.2 and a peak of 26.1 points per game in 1970, with a playoffs points per game of 19.6 and a playoffs peak of 29.2 points per game in 1970. The fact that there's such a wide gap in their numbers makes it difficult to judge who is overall the better scorer, as both men were capable of scoring 25 to 30 points per game in their primes when they were not injured. Both were mid-range and interior scoring machines in their primes that were very frustrating for opposing defenses to play against. Cunningham was a more consistent scorer throughout his career, but Hawkins was the better scorer at his peak. This is very tough, so I'll have to call this category a tie. Just as with scoring, the rebounding category is also very close, as both Hawkins and Cunningham were fantastic rebounders in their primes. Although Hawkins was more athletic, Cunningham's surprising hops for his frame earned him the nickname Kangaroo Kid. Hawkins pulled down 8.8 rebounds a game for his career and 13.5 rebounds per game at his peak in 1968. In the playoffs, he grabbed 12 rebounds per game, peaking at 13.9 rebounds per game in 1970. Cunningham averaged more rebounds per game for his career, 10.4 rebounds per game, and peaking at a similar 13.6 per game in 1970. He had a lower playoffs rebounds per game than Hawkins though, with 9.5, but peaking at a ridiculous 15.4 boards a game in 1971. This category is also close, but Cunningham had 6 seasons where he averaged over 10 rebounds a game, while Hawkins only had 3 such seasons, so I'll give the slight advantage to Cunningham. Both men were fantastic passers for their size and position, as Hawkins averaged 4 assists per game in his career, peaking at 5.2 a game in 1974, and 4.5 assists a game in the playoffs, peaking at 5.9 a game in 1970. Cunningham also averaged 4 assists per game in his career, peaking at 6.3 assists per game in 1973, and 3.6 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at 5.7 a game in 1971. Keep in mind, these two guys both played small forward and power forward, so they were actually fantastic playmakers in their prime, bordering on point forward level. I'll have to say that this category is also a tie, as I cannot say one is even slightly ahead of the other, they are both so equal. In the efficiency and advanced metrics category, we finally come to one where it's definitely not as close as the previous ones. Although they have roughly the same PER, Hawkins is definitely more efficient than Cunningham, and this reflects in his true shooting percentage and a slight win shares per 48 advantage over Cunningham, especially in the playoffs where Hawkins is clearly ahead. This category goes to Connie Hawkins by a small margin. In the defense category, neither were really fantastic defenders, and neither made an all-defensive team, but Cunningham has the lead in defensive win shares by a decent margin. So although Hawkins played less games in his career, that still doesn't exactly count for all of Cunningham's lead, so I'll give Cunningham the win here. In the awards category, both Hawkins and Cunningham won an MVP in the ABA. Both have one finals appearance in their career. Hawkins, however, won an ABA championship and a finals MVP as clearly the best player on his Pittsburgh Pipers team. Cunningham's championship, however, was won as a sixth-man coming off the bench for the 1967 76ers. He was not one of the top 3 players on that team, that being Wilt Chamberlain, Hal Greer, and Chet Walker. However, Cunningham does have more All-NBA and ABA selections, if only by a small margin. It's worth noting that Hawkins had a particularly short prime, but during that prime was always named to the first team. It's close, but Hawkins' championship and finals MVP puts him over the top for me, so this one goes to Connie Hawkins. This has been a very close comparison between 2 all-time underrated forwards, as there's 2 wins for Hawkins, 2 for Cunningham, and 2 ties. If you were to ask me what the tiebreaker was, I'd say Connie Hawkins by a slight hair due to his higher scoring peak and the fact that he missed out on half his prime in the NBA, so the lower numbers that we see from Hawkins do not accurately represent how good he was. Both players could do a little bit of everything on the court during their primes, and are quite underrated today, as Connie Hawkins was blackballed from the NBA in his prime and had his career cut short due to injuries, while Billy Cunningham started as a 6th-man, also had a short prime with his career, also cut due to injuries. I hope you guys learned something new, enjoy this comparison. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.